January 17th, 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with 1,000 invisible mouths. Moisture hung in the air like a living curtain, turning every breath into a labor, every movement into a negotiation with the earth itself. Corporal James Sullivan crouched behind a fallen mahogany trunk, its bark slick with moss and the morning's rain. In his hands he held what the other Marines had called a relic, a Springfield M1 bolt-action, woodstock rifle, designed in 1903, its design philosophy rooted in the previous century. While his brothers-in-arms carried the new semi-automatic M1 Garand, Sullivan cradled 5 rounds of .30-06 ammunition in an internal magazine that required his thumb to work the bolt after every shot. The weapon was older than his father's service in the Great War. It belonged in a museum, they said, or in the hands of a parade ground honor guard, not a forward scout in the hell of the Pacific Theater. Through the emerald maze ahead he could hear them, the Imperial Japanese Army's 38th Division, moving with the confidence of men who believed the jungle was their ally. They had reason for confidence. For 18 months they had swept across the Pacific like a divine wind made flesh, conquering Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. They had humiliated Western powers that had ruled these waters for centuries, toppling colonial giants in weeks when those same powers had predicted years of resistance would be possible. The soldiers of the rising sun had been taught since childhood that they were the descendants of gods, that their emperor was divine, that surrender was worse than death, and that the soft Americans, raised on jazz music and Coca-Cola, would break like rice paper against the steel of Japanese discipline and Bushido spirit. But the jungle has no loyalty to ideology. And on this particular morning, 19 men would learn that a weapon's age matters far less than the hand that holds it. To understand what happened in those 7 minutes requires understanding what both sides believed they were fighting. The Japanese soldiers advancing through that Guadalcanal undergrowth had been conditioned by the finest propaganda machine Imperial Japan could construct. They had been shown photographs of American soldiers lounging with cigarettes, read intelligence reports emphasizing America's love of comfort, of easy living, of mechanical convenience over martial virtue. The Type 38 and Type 99 rifles they carried were newer than Sullivan's Springfield, certainly. Their bayonets were longer, a full 16 inches of steel designed for the psychological terror of close combat. They had been told that American Marines, for all their mechanical advantages, lacked the spiritual strength required for individual combat, that when stripped of their tanks and their aircraft and their artillery, they would reveal themselves as hollow men. The Springfield M1 that Sullivan had refused to exchange for the newer Garand told a different story, one that the Japanese intelligence officers had missed in their analysis of American character. This rifle had been designed by men who understood that warfare was not just about rate of fire, but about precision, about the marriage of man and mechanism, about the kind of intimate knowledge that comes only from 10,000 hours of practice. Sullivan had grown up in Montana, hunting elk in terrain not dissimilar to this jungle in its demands for patience and accuracy. He had learned to shoot before he learned algebra. The Springfield was not his weapon, it was an extension of his nervous system. He knew its quirks the way a violinist knows the temperament of their instrument, where it pulled slightly left at distances beyond 400 yards, how humidity affected the barrel's behavior, the exact pressure required on the trigger to break the shot without disturbing his aim. The Japanese soldiers had been trained for banzai charges, for overwhelming assaults, where individual marksmanship mattered less than collective spirit. Sullivan had been trained by silence and hunger, and the patient work of a hunter who understands that the first shot is often the only shot that matters. They came through the tree line at 0847 hours. The report would later note 19 enemy combatants moving in a loose formation that suggested confidence. They were talking, not loudly, but without the extreme caution that men adopt when they believe death is imminent. Through his rifle's sight, Sullivan could see details, the way one soldier had tied his helmet strap loosely, the cigarette tucked behind another's ear, the casual grip on their weapons that spoke of men who had walked through this jungle before and emerged victorious. They expected perhaps to find an American position. They expected perhaps a firefight where their numbers and their willingness to die would carry the moment. They expected many things. They did not expect a man who could work a bolt-action rifle faster than most men could work a semi-automatic. They did not expect a Marine who had internalized the rhythm of his weapon so completely that the motion, fire, bolt up, bolt back, bolt forward, bolt down, fire, happened faster than conscious thought. They did not expect someone who had spent his childhood putting rounds through targets the size of a coffee cup at 200 yards, not for sport, but because winter meat depended on it. The first shot struck the lead soldier center mass. He dropped without a sound that carried over the jungle's ambient noise. 2 seconds, the second shot took the man to his right, who had just begun to register that something was wrong. 2 seconds. The bolt worked with mechanical precision, Sullivan's cheek never leaving the stock, his breathing controlled in the way his father had taught him. Exhale halfway, hold, squeeze. The third soldier fell as he turned toward the sound, which meant Sullivan was firing at a profile now, a smaller target, and still the 30-06 round found its mark in the space between heartbeats. 2 seconds. Now they understood. Now the casual formation exploded into chaos. Japanese training was excellent. They did not run, they sought cover, they began to return fire. But panic is not something training can fully eliminate, and these men had just watched 3 of their number drop in 6 seconds to an enemy they could not see, could not locate, could not fight. Sullivan's position behind the fallen mahogany gave him concealment and a perfect firing lane. He worked the bolt. 4th target acquired, a soldier who had made the mistake of choosing a tree too narrow for his frame. 2 seconds, 5th target, an NCO attempting to organize a response, marked by the sword at his side. 2 seconds. The mathematics of it were brutal. Sullivan could fire approximately 25 to 30 aimed shots per minute with his Springfield when conditions were ideal. These conditions were ideal. Each time he worked the bolt, another round chambered. Each time his finger touched the trigger, a soldier of Imperial Japan discovered that ideology cannot stop a 150-grain bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second. 6th soldier down, 7th, 8th. The living began to understand that staying in this position meant death, but moving meant exposing themselves to that invisible rifle that seemed to fire with mechanical precision from somewhere in the green tangle ahead. 9th soldier, 10th, 11th, 12th. Somewhere in this sequence, Sullivan reloaded, a process that required him to thumb 5 rounds into the internal magazine, a vulnerability that cost perhaps 6 seconds. But the Japanese soldiers, traumatized and suppressed, used those seconds not to flank, but to hunker deeper into inadequate cover. They had been trained that the enemy needed to reload, that this created opportunities for counterattack. But they had been trained against enemies who carried 8 rounds, not 5, and who took longer to reload than Sullivan's practiced motion required. 13th soldier attempted to flee. 14th soldier rose to provide covering fire, exposing his head and shoulders. 15th soldier made it 3 steps before Sullivan's round caught him. 16th, 17th. The jungle that had seemed like an ally now became a prison. Every shadow could hold the American rifleman. Every gap in the foliage could be his firing lane. 18th soldier fell while attempting to crawl to better cover, moving too fast, creating motion that Sullivan's hunter's eye caught instantly. 7 minutes after the first shot, 19 men lay dead or dying. Sullivan had fired 23 rounds. 4 had missed, a hit rate of approximately 83% under combat conditions that would have broken most marksmen. He had worked his bolt-action rifle 46 times, averaging less than 2 seconds per complete cycle. The Marines who found him 20 minutes later, drawn by the sustained sound of rifle fire, discovered him exactly where he had been when the engagement began, his Springfield still trained on the killing ground, waiting to see if any targets remained. The official after-action report was dry, factual, bureaucratic. But the story that travelled through the Corps carried a different weight. Here was a Marine who had been mocked for refusing to upgrade, who had endured jokes about bringing his grandfather's rifle to war, who had absorbed the pitying looks of men carrying newer, faster, more modern weapons. And he had just accomplished what entire squads might fail to achieve, the complete destruction of an enemy unit in minutes by himself, using a weapon whose design principles were being phased out across the entire US military. When the story reached the Japanese forces, filtered through prisoner interrogations and the dark gossip that travels through armies even in wartime, it carried a different kind of weight. They had been told American soldiers were soft, dependent on their machines, unable to fight with the intimate knowledge of their weapons that Japanese soldiers cultivated through endless drill and spiritual discipline. But here was evidence of something else. An American who knew his rifle better than they knew their own, who could achieve through individual skill what they achieved through collective sacrifice, who represented not weakness, but a different and equally formidable kind of strength. The Springfield M1903 became, in that moment, more than a rifle. It became a symbol of something the Japanese high command had miscalculated about their enemy. Americans did value convenience, yes. They did prefer mechanical advantage when possible. But underneath that preference was a culture that valued individual competence, that had been shaped by a frontier experience where survival depended on personal skill, that created men like Sullivan who saw no contradiction between embracing modernity and mastering traditional craft. The weapon was old, yes, but in the hands of someone who had internalized its rhythms completely, age became irrelevant. What mattered was the 10,000 hours of practice, the muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought, the kind of mastery that cannot be mass-produced or taught through propaganda. In the months that followed Guadalcanal, as the war ground through its terrible calculus of islands and atolls, the story of Sullivan and his ancient rifle took on the quality of myth. Marines told it to each other during quiet moments, embellishing some details, forgetting others, but always returning to the core truth, that 19 enemy soldiers had encountered one American with a bolt-action rifle, and none had survived. Japanese commanders included it in briefings as evidence that American marksmanship had been underestimated. Intelligence analysts debated what it meant that the US military still fielded soldiers who preferred older weapons, whether this represented inadequate supply chains or something more deliberate. But the deeper truth that Sullivan's 7 minutes revealed was about the nature of ideological warfare. The Japanese Empire had constructed an elaborate mythology around the superiority of their spirit, their willingness to sacrifice, their divine destiny. They had looked at American materialism and consumer culture and concluded that this made Americans weak. What they had failed to understand was that American abundance created not weakness, but choice. Sullivan could have taken the M1 Garand. He chose the Springfield because he had mastered it completely. That choice, the agency to select his weapon based on personal competence rather than standardized doctrine, represented something the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Japan could not easily replicate. The Springfield itself, that relic of 1890s design philosophy perfected in 1903, became a recurring presence in Sullivan's remaining combat service. Other Marines began to view it not as an embarrassment but as a badge of honor. The weapon that had been mocked became respected. Men who had questioned Sullivan's judgment asked him about his shooting technique, about how he achieved such speed with the bolt action, about whether the old rifle really was superior in certain situations to the new Garand. Sullivan's answer, when he gave one at all, was simple. Know your weapon better than you know yourself. The rifle's age was irrelevant. His relationship with it was everything. War is ultimately about will, the will to fight, the will to endure, the will to impose your vision of order on chaos. The Japanese Empire had built its military philosophy on the idea that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, that belief in divine destiny created warriors who could defeat enemies with superior resources. And there was truth in that philosophy. Japanese soldiers fought with a fanaticism that stunned American forces throughout the Pacific Campaign, but Sullivan's 7 minutes demonstrated the flaw in assuming that material abundance automatically produces spiritual weakness. The Springfield M1903 in his hands became proof that American culture, for all its seeming softness, its love of comfort, its embrace of convenience, could also produce craftsmen of violence who mastered their tools with complete dedication. The 19 Japanese soldiers who fell that morning had been told they were facing a decadent enemy. They had been promised that American soldiers, stripped of their mechanical advantages, would reveal themselves as inferior in individual combat. They had believed, with the certainty of men raised on propaganda, that their spirit would overcome American material advantage. What they encountered instead was a Marine who embodied a different kind of strength, one rooted not in collective ideology, but in individual mastery, not in divine destiny, but in 10,000 hours of patient practice, not in the contempt for the enemy, but in the respect for craft. The Springfield rifle that Sullivan carried survived the war. It was not placed in a museum, though it deserved to be. It was not melted down for scrap metal. According to records, Sullivan brought it home to Montana, where presumably it returned to its original purpose, hunting elk in the high country, putting meat on the table, serving as a tool rather than a symbol. But for those 7 minutes on Guadalcanal, it had been something more. It had been an argument made in blood and steel, a demonstration that old does not mean obsolete, that tradition and modernity are not enemies, that a free man who chooses his weapon and masters it completely is a formidable opponent, regardless of what century his rifle was designed in. The jungle has long since reclaimed that section of Guadalcanal. The mahogany trunk has rotted, the blood has been washed away by tropical rains, the shell casings have been swallowed by earth and time. But the story persists, passed down through generations of Marines, refined and retold, because it speaks to something deeper than tactics or marksmanship. It speaks to the truth that freedom creates competence, that abundance allows choice, and that when you allow a man to master his craft completely, to choose his tools, to practice without ideological constraint, to develop skill through individual agency rather than collective compulsion, you create a warrior whose strength comes not from propaganda, but from the quiet confidence of absolute mastery. 19 men learned that truth in 7 minutes. The lesson cost them everything, but the echo of those minutes traveled across the Pacific, a whisper that complicated every assumption about what American soldiers were, what they could do, and what they would become when given the freedom to be excellent on their own terms.